actually transnational trade is in Africa's DNA. It's in Africa's blood. For 800 years, this network spanned huge distances across the Sahel, across West Africa, trading salt, trading gold. But they had very elaborate systems that were in place. They established all kinds of stations that are now flourishing towns. And very sadly, as is often the case with sort of traditional African ways of life, is that a fundamental rupture occurred with the arrival of European colonialists. And 700 or 800 years of these trading systems were essentially destroyed within a few decades. And they've never really been rehabilitated. But again, that chapter is very important. It's just a salutary reminder that transnational trade is not something foreign to Africa, but in fact it's in its bloodstream. One thing which I think is important to say is that we're sitting in Johannesburg, in South Africa. And this issue of Africans investing in Africa looks very different from our vantage. In fact, you may think, what is all the fuss about? Because South African companies are doing just fine, thank you, right across the continent. There's many companies that we could mention. But it's very clear that South Africa is an anomaly. South Africa is an exception. This is not the case. It is very difficult and very challenging in most parts of the continent to operate outside your own national frontiers. Now, many people have different theories about the South African exception. I mean, certainly you have to look at post-colonial economies, post-colonial companies, which were very much geared towards local markets, which they had inherited from the colonial powers. Internal governance was very poor, and as a consequence, they rarely produced anything of value add that you could export across borders. And of course, South Africa was very different because prior to the end of apartheid in this country, you had built up a very sophisticated economy, very sophisticated companies. And so when the restrictions at the end of apartheid were lifted, South African companies just flooded into the continent. And you know, they established a foothold, and to some extent a dominant foothold that still remains the case today. So South Africa is an exception. The introduction to this book is written by Paul Collier, who is one of the world's leading experts on development. And he makes a fascinating point in the introduction in which he says that African business has the capacity to change African politics. And what he meant by that is that in our book, no matter what direction we go, it really often, ultimately, always comes back to the nature of African politics, which, as we know, unfortunately, has been much more about patronage than performance. But what's fascinating is what Paul means in that is that, you know, we have this assumption, or for many years it was just assumed that the only way to acquire wealth in Africa was through politics, either directly, in terms of being a minister or a prime minister or a president, or being deeply enmeshed in a country's political ruling party. Now you may say plus ça change, but in reality, Africa now is awash with business role models. It is not the case that you have to go through politics. And so what Paul meant by the capacity to change politics is that you know, people less and less are going to, over time, go into politics as a means to acquire wealth. And instead, those people that will be attracted to politics in general, we hope, will be trying to make a difference, perhaps in a different way.